Have you ever seen a prime minister try to turn a moment of strength into political gold, only to have it blow up right in front of him? That's exactly what happened when Anthony Albanese stood in Parliament this week. He had just taken one of the boldest steps an Australian government has seen in decades, expelling the Iranian ambassador. But instead of being celebrated, he walked straight into an ambush. On live TV, Deputy Liberal leader Sussan Ley delivered a stinging attack that not only humiliated Albanese, but left him scrambling to defend his government's credibility. What should have been a victory lap became a moment of public embarrassment. And the way it played out tells us a lot about timing, politics, and how quickly a leader can lose control of the narrative. Stick around because we're about to break down exactly what went down, why Albanese went mad in Parliament, and how Sussan Ley managed to turn his moment of strength into his most humiliating takedown yet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Coalition welcomes the expulsion of the Iranian ambassador and stands ready to pass laws today to list the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organisation. We called on the government to expel the ambassador last year and demanded the IRGC be listed as a terrorist organisation more than 2 years ago. Since then, the Iranian regime has sponsored attacks on Australian soil. Prime Minister, why didn't you act sooner when the warnings were so clear and the risks so grave?
Before we dive in, what do you think? Was Sussan Ley being too harsh, or was she just saying what everyone else was already thinking? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know where you stand. The scene was already tense. The government had just announced the expulsion of Iran's ambassador, a decision that, on paper, looked like a strong move. It was the first time in post-war history that Australia had expelled an ambassador. That's the kind of headline that could make a prime minister look decisive and tough. But Sussan Ley wasn't going to let Albanese bask in that spotlight. The moment she got the floor, she launched straight into the attack. Her question was sharp and direct. Prime Minister, why didn't you act sooner when the warnings were so clear and the risks so grave? It was a brutal framing. She acknowledged the decision but undercut it at the same time. Instead of applauding the move, she painted Albanese as slow, reactive, and dangerously hesitant. In that instant, the tone shifted. Albanese wasn't standing tall as the leader who expelled the ambassador. He was suddenly on the back foot, forced into defense mode. And here's the thing about politics. The first frame usually sticks. Ley framed him as weak before he even opened his mouth. But this was only the beginning. Ley had much more ammunition ready. Sussan Ley doubled down. She reminded Parliament, and the nation watching, that the coalition had been calling for this exact action for years. She pointed out that the coalition pushed for the IRGC to be listed as a terrorist organization more than 2 years ago. She highlighted that the coalition demanded the expulsion of Iran's ambassador last year. And then came the real sting. Since those calls, she argued, the Iranian regime had already sponsored attacks on Australian soil. By pointing to the timeline, she trapped Albanese in a corner. His decision now looked less like a bold act of leadership, and more like a long overdue reaction. What should have been his win suddenly looked like proof that he had ignored clear warnings. That's political jiu-jitsu at its finest, using your opponent's strength against them. And it worked. Albanese now had to explain not just what he did, but why it took so long. If you think Albanese hesitated too long on this one, hit that like button so more Aussies see this debate. Of course, Albanese wasn't going to just sit there and take it. He tried to push back. He pointed out that the coalition hadn't listed the IRGC during their time in government either. He brought up an interview with Andrew Hastie, a senior coalition figure, who openly admitted the coalition should have acted sooner. In fact, Hastie himself said, "That's a good question. I was the chair of the Intelligence Committee. I was always keen to list it. That's for whoever was in government then to explain." That was Albanese's moment to say, "See, you had the chance, and you didn't act either." He also leaned heavily on intelligence advice. Albanese stressed that his government was acting on the recommendations of agencies like ASIO and the Australian Federal Police. He painted himself as cautious, deliberate, and responsible. But here's the problem. In politics, perception matters more than process. Albanese may have had the logic, but Ley had the optics. And optics win headlines. And Ley wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. Sensing the heat, Albanese switched strategies. He accused the coalition of playing politics with national security. He argued that his government acted the moment intelligence allowed them to. He explained that they needed to safely get Australian personnel out of Tehran before moving forward, and that delay wasn't about hesitation, it was about protecting lives. On paper that sounds reasonable, but here's the catch. Once a leader is defending, they're losing. By framing the coalition as opportunistic and irresponsible, Albanese hoped to regain control. But the damage was already done. Ley had already planted the seed that he was too slow, and now he looked like he was scrambling. Do you think Albanese was being genuinely cautious, or just covering his tracks? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your take. Sussan Ley wasn't done yet. She drove home the contrast with just a few powerful lines. She framed the coalition as proactive and Albanese's government as reactive. The warnings were clear. The risks were grave. With those words, she wasn't just criticizing the delay. She was accusing Albanese of gambling with national security. And the more she hammered it, the more Albanese's explanation sounded like excuses. It was a textbook humiliation, taking what should have been his proudest moment and reframing it as proof of his weakness. And then came the part that really made Albanese look cornered. In desperation, Albanese tried to flip the narrative. He claimed historical credit. For the first time in the post-war era, we expelled an ambassador. It should have been a moment of triumph. Expelling an ambassador is no small move, and history would back him up. But Ley knew exactly how to spin it. If it was that serious, she implied, why did it take so long? Instead of being celebrated for doing something unprecedented, Albanese was shamed for not doing it sooner. It was a perfect reversal. What he thought was his strongest card became his weakest. Have you ever seen a leader lose control of the narrative this fast? Drop a yes or no in the comments. By now, the tension in the chamber was boiling. Albanese was visibly frustrated. His answers grew longer, sharper, and more defensive. The speaker had to step in to calm down interjections. When the speaker says, "Order, order," you know the temperature has hit boiling point. This wasn't just a policy debate anymore. This was personal. Albanese looked rattled, irritated, and, worst of all, cornered on live TV. And in politics, looking rattled is almost as damaging as being wrong. Sussan Ley had managed to do what every opposition dreams of, make the Prime Minister look flustered, not strong. But here's where it really stung, the credibility blow that came next. Albanese's repeated reliance on intelligence advice might sound reasonable to insiders, but to the public it created a dangerous perception. On one hand, he framed himself as cautious and responsible. On the other, Ley painted him as indecisive and reactive. For everyday Australians who don't read intelligence briefings, the optics of delay outweighed the substance of caution. And that's the thing about credibility in politics. It's not about who has the better argument, it's about who wins the perception battle. And on this day, Ley won. If you think perception matters more than politicians admit, share this video so others can see how this clash really went down. So here's the bottom line. Albanese had the policy, the facts, and the historic move. But Ley had the narrative, the timing, and the punchlines. In Parliament, timing isn't just everything. It's the difference between leading and being humiliated. Albanese may have made history by expelling an ambassador, but Ley made headlines by turning his triumph into a takedown. And now the real question isn't just about what happened in Parliament that day. It's about what comes next. Can Albanese recover the narrative? Or will this humiliation stick as yet another example of a leader struggling to look strong under fire? Whose side are you on? Albanese trying to play it safe, or Ley calling him out? Let's debate it in the comments. And if you've watched all the way through, drop a Parliament watcher in the comments, so I know you made it to the end. Don't forget to like this video if you think timing matters in politics, and subscribe for more stories that pull back the curtain on Australia's most heated political battles. Because trust me, this clash was just the beginning.